Good afternoon to everybody. And the noise may be coming from my area. It's 6 a.m. where I am in Athens. So I'm in a cafeteria, which is very nicely allowing me to have the video now. And I hope that I can be heard. I want to thank you for inviting me and thank SHAPE for its leadership. And I just had the privilege to listen to Alison Brainovsky and Chung-In Moon. And these are brilliant statements that we've all been treated with. Absolutely insightful. I absolutely agree with all that has been said. The world has gone mad. But especially the Anglo-Saxon world, I'm afraid. I don't know whether there is any sense at all in our little English-speaking corner of the world. I'm, of course, speaking of the United States, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. There's something profoundly disheartening about the politics of our countries right now. The deep madness, I'm afraid, is British imperial thinking taken over by the United States. My country, the US, is unrecognizable now compared even to 20 or 30 years ago. I'm not sure, to tell you the truth, who runs the country. I do not believe it is the President of the United States right now. We are run by generals, by our security establishment. The public is privy to nothing. The lies that are told about foreign policy are daily and pervasive by a mainstream media that I can barely listen to or read anymore. The New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and the main television outlets are 100% repeating government propaganda by the day. And it's almost impossible to break through. What is this about? Well, as you've heard, it's about a madness of the United States to keep U.S. hegemony. Militarized, dominated by the thinking of generals who are mediocre intellects, personally greedy, and without any sense, because their only modus operandi is to make war. And then cheerled by Britain, which is unfortunately in my adult life increasingly pathetic in being a cheerleader for the United States for this hegemony and for war. Whatever the US says, Britain will say it 10 times more enthusiastically. And it could not love more the war in Ukraine, which is the great second Crimean War for the British media and for the British political leadership. Now, how Australia and New Zealand fall for this idiocy is really a deep question for you, because people should know better, but I'm afraid that it is the Five Eyes and the security establishment that tell the politicians, to the extent that the politicians are involved in this, well, this is how we have to do it. This is our security state. And I don't think our politicians necessarily have much role in this. By the way, the public has no role at all in U.S. foreign policy, at all. We have no debate, no discussion, no deliberation, no debates over voting the 113 billion, but in fact much more money spent on the Ukraine war so far. There's not been an hour of organized debate, even in the Congress, on this, much less in the public. But my guess is that your security establishment is really the driver of this. And then they explained to the prime minister and to the others, this is the utmost national security, and this is what America has told us. And let me explain what we're seeing. And of course, you cannot divulge this to the broader public, but this is at the essence of the struggle for survival in the world. Everything I see myself, I'm 43 years in this activity as an economic advisor all over the world, is nonsense. And one thing that would be interesting for people to look at to understand these developments is a very telling article by a former colleague of mine at Harvard, Robert Blackwell, and Ashley Tellis, written for the Council on Foreign Relations about 8 years ago now. I just want to read a couple excerpts from it because it laid out the whole plan of what's happening right now pretty directly, which is how things work in the US, which is through the establishment media, you're basically told in not necessarily completely explicit terms what's going to happen, because what is unfolding right now is really part of a longer term planned agenda. It's not ad hoc. So here's what Blackwell and Tellis wrote in 2015. First, quote, "Since its founding, the United States has consistently pursued a grand strategy focused on acquiring and maintaining preeminent power over various rivals, first on the North American continent, then in the Western Hemisphere, and finally globally." And then argues that this goal of primacy ought to remain the central objective of U.S. grand strategy in the 21st century. So what's the goal? The goal is very straightforward. It is primacy of the United States globally. Then Blackwell and Tellis lay out the game plan for China. So they tell us what to do. Here's the list. I'm only excerpting. Quote, "Create new preferential trading arrangements among U.S. friends and allies to increase their mutual gains through instruments that consciously exclude China." Okay, this is the game that already Obama started with TPP. He couldn't get it through, but I'll go on and then I'll comment. Second, create a technology control regime to block China's strategic capabilities, to build up, quote, "power political capacities of U.S. friends and allies on China's periphery," and strengthen U.S. military forces along the Asian rimlands, despite any Chinese opposition. What I find remarkable about this is this was a list made in 2015. It's exactly the step-by-step plan of action. This is repeated in recent history. In 1997, Zbig Brzezinski, in an article in Foreign Affairs, laid out exactly the timeline for NATO enlargement and the intention to include Ukraine in NATO enlargement, because this was already the security establishment plan. Of course, it's led us directly to the Ukraine war, which is a war over NATO enlargement. Now the friends that have, and the geniuses that have brought the world the Ukraine war, want to bring the war to your neighborhood with, as Professor Moon said, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization starting to open its offices in Asia, which is not exactly the North Atlantic. So this is where we are. It's not absolutely simple to see through for one main reason, at least in the US. I don't know what it's like in Australia, but I expect that it's the same. We have no honesty or discussion at all about this. The policies are owned entirely by the security establishment, the military-industrial complex, the network of, quote, think tanks, which are non-think tanks in Washington, every one of which is funded by the military-industrial complex. They've taken over the East Coast universities entirely, where I teach. I taught 20 years at Harvard. I teach at Columbia University. This is our milieu right now. And the silent coup happened in essence. No debate, no public politics, no honesty, no documents revealed, everything secret, everything confidential, and mysterious moves. And since I happen to be an economist that engages with heads of state around the world, I hear a lot of things. And so I've seen and heard a lot of things directly, which help me to understand the lies every day. But you will not find any of this in our public discourse. Just a word about the Ukraine war. Completely predictable and part of a plan of action that goes back to the early 1990s to essentially bring Ukraine into the US military orbit. And Brzezinski, again in 1997 in the Global Chessboard, his geopolitical book, laid it out completely. Russia without Ukraine is nothing. Ukraine is the geographical pivot for Eurasia, and basically go get it. Interestingly, Brzezinski said in 1997 in the book, but the one thing absolutely American policymakers need to ensure is that they don't push Russia and China into an alliance together. But then he says, that's pretty much unthinkable. Don't worry about that, but that would be the craziest thing in the world. And it's exactly what these crazy people have done. I happen to have been an advisor to Gorbachev, to Yeltsin, and to Kuchma in the early days of both the late days of perestroika and the early days after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. I watched very closely what was happening. I saw that the United States was absolutely uninterested in any way in helping Russia to stabilize. The idea from the start was unipolarity, keep Russia down, and take steps already decided in 1992, basically, in direct contradiction to what had been told to Gorbachev and Yeltsin to start expanding NATO. So this is a game plan with a long horizon. When it comes to China, and by the way, the US was deeply implicated in the overthrow of Ukraine's president in 2014. It was a coup. It was to an important extent a regime change operation of the United States, not entirely, but to a very significant extent. I happen to see part of it in a very weird way up close, and I know how US money poured into supporting the Maidan, and it was incredibly disgusting and very unnerving, and Putin noticed that the US contributed to the overthrow of a friendly government next door, in the context of the explicit intention to push NATO, by the way, not only to Ukraine, but also to Georgia. And when one looks at the map, it's Brzezinski's idea: surround Russia in the Black Sea region. Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia would all be members of NATO. That would be the end of Russian power projection in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. So go these geniuses. And Putin gave many opportunities for negotiation out of this. The Minsk agreements endorsed by the UN Security Council in 2021, December 17, he put on the table a perfectly reasonable document for negotiation, the draft US-Russia security arrangements, which called for an end to NATO expansion. The U.S. blew it off. I called the White House after that was put on the table, spoke to one of our top security officials, and said, negotiate. Stop the NATO enlargement. You have a chance to avoid war. The United States' formal response to Putin was, NATO is non-negotiable. This is something only between the U.S. and Ukraine, and Russia has no say in NATO enlargement to Ukraine. It's a mind-boggling way to pursue foreign affairs because it is a direct road to war. As you know, I hope everybody understands, this war in Ukraine was close to ending in March 2022 with a negotiated agreement a month after Russia invaded on February 24th, with an agreement between Ukraine and Russia that the United States stopped because the U.S. said, fight on, don't negotiate, don't accept neutrality. And so here we are in a war that continues to escalate towards possible nuclear war, which is what would happen if Russia were to suffer deep defeats on the battlefield. It's not doing that right now. It's not experiencing that. But if it did, it just escalates to nuclear war. Russia is not going to be defeated, pushed out of Crimea, and go home meekly and saying, we're sorry we did that. It's going to escalate if it needs to escalate. So we are right now in a spiral that is extremely dangerous. Japan plays utterly into this. And Australia, it's so sad to watch Australia in a accepting to be used in this reckless way, to pay a fortune to be used in this reckless and provocative way. And U.S. actions, by and large, till now, with very few exceptions, U.S. actions are putting us on a path to war with China in the same way that U.S. actions did in Ukraine. Only this war, well, either war could end everything. But the whole idea of the U.S. and its allies fighting China is mind-boggling in its implications, in its stupidity, in its profound dangers, and in its utter divorce from real security interests and from reality, because China is not a threat to Australia. It is not a threat to the world. And last time I looked, correct me because there's some experts in the room, many more than I, but I don't know of a single overseas Chinese invasion in its history, by the way, other than on the borders. I don't know in its whole history, except when the Mongols briefly ruled China and tried to invade Japan. Other than the Mongol invasion, defeated by a typhoon, other than that, I don't know of another single case in 2,200 years of Chinese statecraft. So this is not exactly at the top of my worry list. This is what worries me about the world is a deeply neurotic United States that aims to be number one, that can't be number one in the way that it self-believes to be number one, that has a pathetic, and I'm sorry to use the term, but it is pathetic, cheerleader in London every day saying how wonderful it is. Empire is great. You should go try it. We love it.
Jeffrey,
I'm going to stop here. Sorry to go on and on, but let me just, if I could, 1 minute to say what should be done. The war in Ukraine could end the day after Biden steps up and says NATO will not enlarge to Ukraine. Believe it. The basis for negotiation has been there for 20 years and rejected by the US. Second, the idea of opening NATO offices in Asia is mind-boggling in its risk and its stupidity. And please tell the Japanese, stop this. It's reckless. Third, the U.S. approach to Taiwan, except in a glimmer of reality of Blinken last month, is profoundly dangerous, provocative, and deliberately so. Fourth, what is needed is regional dialogue in Asia, among Asians and among the Asia Pacific. And fifth, use RCEP, because RCEP is actually the correct concept for the region, to bring together China, Korea, Japan, ASEAN, Australia, and New Zealand in a coherent framework, especially around the climate challenge, energy policy, trade policy, investment policy, would do a world of good, not only for the 15 in the Asia Pacific, but for the entire world. Sorry to have run on so long and to ramble, but it's so important what SHAPE is doing. You're completely on the right track, and all best wishes to your efforts. It's so good to hear some wisdom coming from Europe, because unfortunately the dominant discourse in Europe is like the dominant discourse in the United States these days, which is war all the time. And I've always counted on Europe to be smarter than the US on these matters, because the US makes so many of these awful, unnecessary wars. And I've been surprised and very alarmed and disappointed by the European leaders falling into line with the U.S. military-industrial complex. And Claire, thank you. It's just so good to hear your wonderful remarks. It's gotten very bad in Europe, as it has in the United States. Very hard to reach the mainstream because the media, the corporate media, have completely blocked out any honest accounting of how we got into the Ukraine war and what's happening and why it's a disaster. So it's very hard to even share basic facts right now. I know I was pretty frequently on just normal mainstream TV, but not these days, not in the last couple of years, because nobody wants to hear. And I begged the New York Times even for one editorial to tell the truth about this war, and I kind of badgered them into accepting something, and they accepted it, they edited it, they were getting ready to print it. And then they said, "Oh, I'm so sorry, Professor Sachs, we're not going to run it after all." So the fact of the matter is the corporate mainstream media is just completely saturated with the U.S. government propaganda. So with that backdrop, here we are sharing some truth and sharing some thoughts together. I go back more than 30 years in Russia, Ukraine, U.S., European issues, because more than 30 years ago, I was trying to help President Gorbachev, and then trying to help President Yeltsin, and then trying to help President Kuchma, the first president of independent Ukraine, to overcome all of the huge difficulties that attended the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union collapsed because it was a miserable system. It didn't work. And Gorbachev knew it, and he wanted a normal society with normal relations with the US, and he wanted a common European home, and I loved the man for it. And when he asked me to be on his advisory team, of course, I said yes. And I learned that the United States could not take yes for an answer. It could not accept the idea of just a normal, cooperative relationship with a reformed Soviet Union or with an independent Russia. The U.S. wanted unipolarity. The U.S. wanted dominance. The U.S. wants its way on everything. It's crazy. We're 4.2% of the world. We don't and can't and shouldn't aspire to run the world. We should aspire to cooperate. Well, I saw firsthand in a very painful few years that the U.S. doesn't like cooperation. First, it was the Bush senior administration. Well, that was Cheney and Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld, the neocons of the day. And they basically didn't want to lift one finger to help the transformation of Russia into a new independent state that was peacefully integrated with its neighbors. Of course, they told lies. Gorbachev unilaterally said that he would disband the Soviet military alliance, the Warsaw Pact. And James Baker III, our Secretary of State at the time, and Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the foreign minister of Germany, ran to Gorbachev. If you do this, we will absolutely not take advantage of the Soviet Union. We will absolutely not move NATO into where the Warsaw Pact is right now. We will not move NATO 1 inch eastward. And there's a massive, wonderful archive of material with this promise repeated many times to Gorbachev by the Germans, by the US, by the Secretary General of NATO himself to a visiting Russian delegation. Well, turned out all to be lies, because as soon as the Soviet Union dissolved at the end of 1991, the neocons started planning the expansion of NATO, because they couldn't take yes for an answer that we should just have peace and cooperation. They needed the expansion. And who championed the expansion? Of course, the military-industrial complex led the lobbying. And it's not even subtle. The Raytheon top lobbyist was the head of the committee for the expansion of NATO. Well, duh. This was money. We can sell weapons. We can expand our military bases. We can expand our military budget. And of course, these neocons had the idea that they would make several wars of choice. They actually decided that already in the 1990s, that there would be several wars of choice, because there was no one to oppose it. So the US could depose all of the governments that were still aligned with Russia. That means the Syrian government, the Libyan government, the Saddam Hussein, and so forth. And they would find whatever excuse, whatever lies, whatever alleged provocations to launch wars of choice. And of course, we know that this happened. But the real origin of the Ukraine war was this relentless NATO march eastward, despite the core promises that were made and the core common sense, by the way, not just the promises. Why provoke Russia? And when Clinton actually started the machinery of NATO enlargement, his own Secretary of Defense, William Perry, thought about resigning in protest because he thought it was such a terrible idea that this would just lead to a new Cold War, just at the time that relations were being normalized. And our top diplomats knew this. They understood this. Jack Matlock, the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, said, don't expand NATO. You said no, and it's only going to provoke. Excuse me. Oh, God, I get choked up over this. George Kennan, our top historian diplomat, the person who invented containment, that concept of the 1940s, he never wanted to be militarized in this way. And he absolutely said, this is the biggest mistake imaginable to start expanding NATO. Well, I watched a lot of this pretty close up. Clinton, kind of as usual, not thinking very much, very short-term thinking, started the NATO expansion in the 1990s. That was to Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic. The Russians were very unhappy, but it wasn't a big crisis. It wasn't on their border. Then Bush Jr. comes in, all the wars of choice. And not to mention, by the way, in 1999, Clinton bombs, and not Clinton only, NATO bombs Belgrade for 6 straight weeks. Not exactly to Russia's liking, absolutely horrible. And that worsened the relations further. Then in 2002, the neocons under Bush Jr. called for the unilateral U.S. withdrawal from the anti-ballistic missile treaty. Unbelievable. The Russians said, stop, don't do this. This puts us in a threat. This destabilizes the nuclear deterrence, which is our basis for just peacefully being able to trust each other and keeping on a path of denuclearization. Well, the U.S. unilaterally withdraws and starts planning for placing missiles near Russia. And the Aegis missiles go into Poland and Romania within the next decade. Well, the Russians are really getting pretty upset about this. And then George W. expands NATO to 7 more countries in 2007. The 3 Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, and Slovenia. And Putin goes to the Munich Security Summit in 2007 and says, come on, stop. You promised not 1 inch eastward, and now it's 10 countries you've expanded to. So the U.S., in its infinite wisdom, as usual, what does it do? The next year, George W. Bush Jr., with, by the way, our U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Victoria Nuland. I hope that name rings a bell. She's currently our Deputy Secretary of State. They call for NATO to enlarge further. And where? To the 2,000-kilometer border with Russia, Ukraine, and to Georgia. Georgia, not the state, Georgia, the country, on the eastern edge of the Black Sea. Look at a map, it ain't a North Atlantic country. But what it is a plan to surround Russia in the Black Sea. Because the idea was, and it was a very premeditated U.S. idea, that with NATO enlargement, NATO would be in Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia, completely surrounding Russia in the Black Sea. And notably, Russia's naval base in Sevastopol. And that was the idea. That, by the way, was the same idea of Lord Palmerston in 1853. So it's not a very original idea. It was the whole basis of the first Crimean War. And so these neocons wanted to fight the second Crimean War. And of course, you could hear the cheers of Britain, which is imperialist nostalgia to the essence in its political class. Yes, yes, yes. We could surround Russia and the Black Sea just like Lord Palmerston wanted to do a century and a half earlier. Well, Putin says, do not do this. This could be incredibly destabilizing. But by the way, it wasn't just Putin who sent a secret memo back from Moscow to Washington to Condoleezza Rice. Well, of course, none other than Bill Burns, Bill Burns was then the U.S. ambassador to Russia. But you may recall the name. He's currently our CIA director. And he sent a secret memo, because everything in the U.S. government is secret, by the way. He sent a secret memo entitled "Niet" means "niet." And he explained something so basic, so obvious, that for Russia, this is a absolute hardcore bright red line. Do not go to Ukraine. And that it's not just Putin, it's the entire Russian society. They don't want the US military bases. They don't want Aegis missiles. They do not want to be crowded on their border by the US military. And it makes perfect sense, because we wouldn't like it either. But, American security state leaders who don't ask us Americans, they're a little hard of hearing. So, did you say red line? We didn't hear that. So, of course, Bush pushes through the commitment by NATO to expand to Ukraine and to Georgia. I know European leaders told me in 2008, what is your president doing? But Europe, they're, I don't get it exactly, but they will not oppose the US in public. So they complained to me, but then they, in the end, signed on to Bush's crazy idea of expanding NATO to Ukraine and to Georgia. Now, there was one last safety valve to understand in this, and that is the Ukrainians did not want this. Ukraine is a divided society, ethnically Ukrainian, ethnically Russian. They didn't want this crowding. They knew that this would destabilize the situation. So the elected president, Viktor Yanukovych, said, we will be neutral. We will not alarm Russia. Also, we'll extend a lease in Crimea for the Sevastopol naval fleet until 2042. We want quiet. The United States neocons don't like quiet. They want just to get their way. So in the end of 2013, they helped stoke first protests against Yanukovych, and then the violent overthrow of Yanukovych in February 2014. And we know that Victoria Nuland and Jake Sullivan and Joe Biden all played a role in the violent overthrow of the Ukrainian president. That's just a fact. Now, so much is hidden from view that we don't know exactly time and date, but the Russians intercepted one of Victoria Nuland's phone calls and posted it on YouTube so everybody can listen to it, as she and the US ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Piot, plot the next post-Yanukovych government several weeks before a violent storming of the government buildings in Kiev. That's what happened. That's when the war started. We overthrew the government that wanted stability. And in came a series of governments that were Russophobic and pro-NATO and at the American service. And Obama and Trump and Biden pumped in arms. Now, just to finalize how we came to this current utter tragedy and disaster. When Biden came in, I had hopes, okay, maybe something rational. No way. Biden doubled down on Ukraine becoming a NATO member, doubled down repeatedly in 2021, said NATO will enlarge to Ukraine. And on December 17th, 2021, Putin, really at wit's end, because he could not get the US to engage in diplomacy, put on the table, and you can find it on the internet, a draft U.S.-Russia security agreement to avert a war. And at the time, the security agreement said, don't expand NATO, don't put your missiles close to our borders, and implement the Minsk II agreement, which is a United Nations Security Council-backed agreement for autonomy of the Russian-speaking regions in the east of Ukraine, which the Ukrainian nationalists blew off, and the United States said, yeah, don't worry about it. You don't have to follow through on a UN Security Council agreement. And Putin said, honor that agreement. Well, the basic story is, of course, the US refused to negotiate on these points. And on February 21st, 2022, there was a Russian Security Council meeting. You can find the minutes online again in the Russian government in English transcription or translation. President Putin calls on the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. Minister Lavrov, give us a report on your diplomatic initiatives in regard to our security. And Lavrov says, the United States has formally notified us that the NATO enlargement issue is non-negotiable, that it's none of our business. That was the final step before the Russian invasion on February 24th. We rejected every single diplomatic chance to avoid a war. And we thought, okay, our wonderful weapons and our financial sanctions will do Russia in. And by the way, you know, I've been observing these kinds of things for 40 years. I wrote an article, it was, I think in June, actually, so it was a couple months after this, saying that these neocon ploys are doomed to fail. The sanctions aren't going to kill the Russian economy. The wonder weapons are not going to defeat Russia and so forth. So obvious if you've seen this particular show repeatedly, as we have, all the promises of our generals and the military industrial complex and all the rest, wrong again and again and again. But what we did do was trap Ukraine in a devastating war between the US and Russia. So we provide the weapons, we provide, and I'll put it in quotation marks, the intelligence, because it's not very intelligent intelligence. And we tell them, run to the front lines. And tens of thousands of Ukrainians have died just in recent weeks because of this. An absolutely predictable bloodbath. And when the Ukrainians tried to negotiate with the Russians in March 2022, just after the start of the invasion, the US stopped the negotiations. And when the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, said last fall, you know, maybe this is the time to negotiate, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who steps up? Secretary Nuland, the endless neocon. Doesn't matter whether she's working for Cheney, whether she's working for Hillary, whether she's working for Biden. She's the perpetual neocon. She says, no, the time's not right for negotiations. What is the subtext of that? Well, a lot more Ukrainians have to die. And that's where we are right now. And this administration doesn't know what to do because all its great plans backfired, but Biden doesn't want to look weak. He's, facing an election next year. So as usual, they just tell the Ukrainians, just keep running into the Russian lines. Just keep dying. It is the cliche, fight to the last Ukrainian. And we even have senators like Romney say, this is great. What's the problem? No Americans are dying. I'm paraphrasing, but that's basically what Romney says and what a lot of American leaders are saying. Yeah, we could put in $100 billion. What is that among friends in the military industrial complex? Of course, it means a lot to Americans who might care about their sustenance. But what they really think is, yeah, if the Ukrainians are ready to die for this, it weakens Russia and so forth. And that's where we are till now. So my conclusion, we could have avoided this war entirely. We could have avoided loss of territory. We could have avoided everything because there was no demand for any of this until the U.S. pushed and pushed and pushed and is tone deaf, can't hear anyone else, doesn't believe anyone has red lines except the United States, and is on the path to do the same thing with Taiwan right now. And that's the war talk. So we're not out of this by any means. We're still in the midst of this neocon-dominated American foreign policy. It's what Kissinger famously said, to be a foe of the United States is dangerous, but to be a friend is fatal. So we embrace our friends like Ukraine to the point of their destruction. And now we're angling or threatening or escalating in our tensions with China for a war over Taiwan. I was just in Taiwan a couple of weeks ago. What a wonderful and beautiful place, and very successful. And we are stoking a crisis by feeding it with armaments. So sorry to have talked so long, but thank you for being the voices for peace and sanity and rationality in this country. Biden's asked for another 20 plus billion. This is our moment to say, stop it already. Your reelection, actually, Mr. Biden, doesn't count compared to the lives you are wasting, the tens of thousands who will die because you don't want an embarrassment on your watch. It's not going to help your campaign to be in a war next year. Nobody wants this in the United States. We don't like this. This is dangerous. This is unnecessary. We don't support you, Mr. President, in this. So stop now. It'll be a lot worse in your campaign. The whole concept that you have to look tough and strong for your 2024 reelection is a nonsense, and it's profoundly immoral. So we need to raise our voice now. I think more and more congressmen and senators are getting the idea that while they don't ask us our opinions in the United States about these issues, because it's not really about what Americans think, it's about what the military-industrial complex demands. We don't like it one bit. Actually, the first lie came when the Soviet Union shot down a CIA spy plane, the U-2 spy plane with Gary Powers, just on the eve of what was supposed to be a summit between Eisenhower and Soviet Party Chairman Nikita Khrushchev. And the CIA lies for a living, we know this, but it lied to the President of the United States also, saying, Mr. President, don't worry, they can't shoot down the spy plane, it's too high, and if they do shoot down the spy plane, it's designed to disintegrate, and if it doesn't disintegrate anyway, the pilot is going to take his cyanide pill. There's no way anything can happen to embarrass you. And of course, they shoot down the spy plane, they get the wreckage, they get the pilot alive, Gary Powers. They don't announce that. They say we have been spied upon and downed a plane without revealing those details. And Eisenhower comes out and says, no, this is a weather craft that went off course from Turkey. And then the Soviets reveal, we have the fuselage, we have the pilot who has told us about his spy mission, direct, blatant lies. Then soon after this comes the direct, blatant lies of the Bay of Pigs. It's dangerous. And this is the CIA, by the way, and it's the CIA till today, in my view. It is lying and unaccountable, and really never called to task for these lies because the public doesn't know them, doesn't understand what's going on. But from the Soviet US point of view, within months of the Kennedy administration, this air was poisoned. And there was one other thing that was absolutely precipitating all of this, which was, and very fundamental and completely never discussed in America almost at all, but there had been no peace treaty at the end of World War II. And the Cold War emerged, in fact, over a bitter dispute between the Soviet Union and the United States about the future of Germany. The Soviet Union had lost more than 20 million people in the war and did not want to see German remilitarized. The United States, on the other hand, decided that the three occupied regions from the western side, the US, French, and British regions, would form a single new Federal Republic of Germany. The remaining fourth part, the Soviet-occupied part, would become the German Democratic Republic, the GDR. But the western side would become the bulwark of a new military alliance, NATO, and it would be remilitarized. And the Soviet Union said, no, we just lost more than 20 million people. Now, within a few years, you're remilitarizing. Well, of course, the United States never listened, never negotiated, and at the end of the 1950s, took another step. Eisenhower was flirting with the idea, maybe we should just give our allies control over nuclear weapons as well, so we can reduce the U.S. Troops numbers in Europe. Eisenhower was very frugal. He was a fiscal conservative, and he wanted to bring troops home and use the nuclear shield. And so there was, at the end of the 1950s, lots of talk about nuclear sharing. And this was freaking out the Soviet Union also. And the United States doesn't know how to talk to anybody. There's no diplomacy. There are mortal enemies. There's no one to negotiate. And so the situation by the time Kennedy came in was completely fraught. Then came the Bay of Pigs. Then Khrushchev said, okay, we need to teach Americans a bit of their own lessons. We'll put missiles in Cuba. And Khrushchev had a quite remarkable exchange with Andrei Gromyko, as foreign minister. Gromyko said, no, what, war? And Khrushchev said, no, not war, just basically teach these Americans about their arrogance. They have missiles in Turkey. We're going to put missiles in Cuba. Nothing about war. But of course, everything immediately spiraled out of control when the missile placements were discovered and the subterfuge that the Soviets were using to place the missile systems in place. And it was like the subterfuge of the United States doing what it did on its side. Things get out of hand. And as soon as Kennedy saw the U-2 spy plane over Cuba taking these pictures of missile sites, he convened an executive committee, ExComm, and it was almost unanimous. Well, we got to shoot down these sites. We have to take them out before they can be deployed. And it was unanimous, essentially, that there needed to be an immediate war, and the Joint Chiefs were told to go off and plan the military campaign against Cuba. Would it be an air campaign? Would it just be to take out the sites? How many troops would be needed, and so forth? Kennedy, interestingly, to make a very long story short, had lunch by coincidence with Adlai Stevenson, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, on the first day of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Kennedy had seen the pictures. And Adlai Stevenson said to Kennedy, well, of course you need diplomacy to end this, and exchange the missiles with the Turkish missiles. Kennedy was shocked because no other advisor had said anything about diplomacy. It was basically unanimous for a military approach, which, by the way, almost surely may be too strong, although I'm not sure it is, but most likely would have led to nuclear annihilation, because our doctrine was that if we were attacked by a nuclear weapon, we would give a full response. By the way, full meaning not only the Soviet Union, but Eastern and Central Europe, China, hundreds of millions of people killed. And now we learned afterwards from the nuclear winter, maybe all of humanity perishing from starvation afterwards. But Stevenson laid the idea of maybe a negotiated settlement. Well, to make a long story short, as people know, Kennedy really almost alone, though with this hint from Stevenson, and then with his brother Robert pushing and Ted Sorensen pushing and a few others pushing, turned the tide over a few days that don't do something precipitous. Let's try to figure out what's in Khrushchev's mind. And Kennedy came to realize, because he had people like the Air Force head, Curtis LeMay, who just wanted nuclear war, it seems, or a first strike against the Soviet Union, that he was surrounded by a lot of hotheads who could end the world. And he realized Khrushchev probably was as well. And the two of them came to realize we better tamp this down. And they did. And they agreed on a deal of this removal of missiles, both from Cuba and from Turkey. The big mistake Kennedy made, and I always think it's unfair to call it a mistake because he saved the world, so you get a lot of credit for that. But the mistake he made was insisting that the deal be secret, so that it looked to the American people like he had simply faced down the Soviet Union and they had backed away, because it wasn't known that the removal of the American missiles were part of an exchange. And that wasn't known for decades, actually.
So let's talk about how Kennedy changed and what he set out to do. And of course, it was all cut short by his assassination in November of 1963.
I think first it's fair to say that being president of the United States is a tough job. And it's impossible to do right in the early days and early years because you don't get it. And our security state in the United States, which was created by the National Security Act of 1947, which created a secret security state and a private army of the United States called the CIA, which is one half its function because it does intelligence and it does private warfare of the United States. And the whole apparatus is secret and largely out of control. And it is absolutely out of control by any public understanding or scrutiny or accountability or congressional oversight today as it was in the early 1960s. Well, Kennedy came in with a lot of energy and idealism and brilliance, and he stumbled terribly in the first year with the Bay of Pigs, Cuban invasion, and then in the second year, the near disaster of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And my view is he had the potential for greatness at the beginning, and by his third year, he had become a magnificent politician and statesman of the first order, one of our truly great presidents. Not so much in the first 2 years, although the potential was there, but the growth that came through this set of trials was extraordinary. Already after the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy was so disturbed by the CIA that he was beside himself about how they had led the U.S. and his administration and himself personally into this awful debacle. He didn't trust the CIA. After the Cuban Missile Crisis and after hearing people like Curtis LeMay even essentially calling Kennedy a traitor for not launching the war or a coward, and feeling all of this pressure for war, he was profoundly disturbed and profoundly moved and profoundly scared at how fragile the world was. and he was determined to do something in 1963. And he
Let me just interject. He fired Dulles and he fired Bissell. So he actually took on the CIA establishment and triggered deep animus. And I want you, as you go on, to talk about this speech. But one of the things I found fascinating from your book is how few people he informed about what it was he was about to say. And so I want to make sure we talk about the content of what he said.
So Kennedy wanted to say to the American people, peace is possible, even with the Soviet Union, even with the other side. And the whole content of the speech is they are human beings like we are. They want to live. They want to protect their children. They want to have a future. And this speech is unbelievable because it's the only foreign policy speech I know of anywhere where it is not telling the other side what to do, not making threats, not reveling in glory, not saying we are number one, not saying they are evil, but saying to the American people, we need to reconsider our own position. And remember, today we're told every day by the completely irresponsible, reckless, and ignorant mass media like the New York Times, I'm going to say, because it's terrible, and like the Washington Post and others, there's no one to talk to. There's no one to negotiate with over Ukraine. And in the Cold War in 1963, it was even more like that. The Cuban Missile Crisis had just occurred. Could you even imagine negotiating with the Soviet Union? And Kennedy's whole message is, we can negotiate. They want the same things. They too will abide by treaties as long as those treaties are also in their interest. And they can be relied upon to abide by treaties that are in their interest and also in our interest. There is a benefit of cooperation. This is rational. In fact, the pursuit of peace is the rational end of rational men, says President Kennedy.
I just want to read a couple sections because it is an absolutely remarkable, and as you point out through Sorensen, beautifully elegiac and just gorgeously written. But these are some of the things. I want to read three short sections. I speak of peace, this is Kennedy, as the necessary rational end of rational men. I realize that the pursuit of peace is not as dramatic as the pursuit of war, and frequently the words of the pursuer fall on deaf ears, but we have no more urgent task. And then he says, so let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests, and to the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. And just to conclude, he asks in the speech, what kind of peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war. Not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and to build a better life for their children, not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women, not merely peace in our time, but peace for all time. I mean, this is incredible.
It gives you goosebumps. Of course, I've listened, I don't know how many dozens or hundreds of times to the speech. I've made my family listen on so many occasions. But the words are thrilling. The words are mesmerizing in their beauty. And Ted Sorensen has a big hand in that as well. And in their ability to make change. And I think one of the things that Kennedy also says in here, which is incredible, is his advice on leadership. And I don't have exactly the words here, but to paraphrase, he says, by defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly toward it. So the goal of peace, if made to be manageable, practical, like a treaty to stop atomic testing stop atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons, is a practical, manageable step, and people draw hope from it. So the speech was so riveting and powerful, by the way, kept completely outside of the bureaucracy. It was essentially hidden from the security apparatus, from the State Department, the CIA, even the White House. Only Sorensen and Kennedy worked on it basically until the last moment. Then they said, I'm giving this. Kennedy said, I'm giving it. So it could not be vetoed by state or by the Defense Department or the National Security Council or anybody else. And he gave it. And what is amazing, absolutely amazing, is that Khrushchev heard it, was carried away, summoned the U.S. envoy, Kennedy's envoy to Moscow, Averell Harriman, and said, this is the finest speech by an American president since FDR. I want to make peace with your president. The words were so powerful. The motivation, the ideas were so powerful. Kennedy disseminated the speech through Pravda, Izvestia, online.
Isn't that hilarious? Pravda reprinted it.
Exactly, and broadcast the speech. And within a few weeks, they had signed the agreement. Within a few weeks. Absolutely an astounding achievement. Then Kennedy, just to say, he was also the grassroots politician. He was a political guy to the core. He went out to campaign for it. And so he took his tour around the United States. The Joint Chiefs, oh, well, we don't know. They come to testify in Congress and try to knock down this agreement. And Kennedy carried the American public overwhelmingly, and then won a decisive victory in the Senate 60 years ago, just now, for the ratification of this treaty. And this is the time when we're talking is the time of the UN General Assembly. Kennedy went to tell the leaders what this meant in another completely magnificent address. And he said, this is not the end of conflict, but it is a ray of hope piercing through the clouds. And he ends his address to the world leaders assembled in front of him in the chamber of the UN General Assembly. Kennedy, having brought peace, brought hope, and all the world leaders assembled in front of him. And he says to them that Archimedes is said to have told his friends, give me a place to stand and I can move the world. Fellow leaders of the world, let us see if we can take our stand here in this place, in this time, to move the world towards peace. And you just can't get better than that. The idealism, the hope, the practicality, and Kennedy infused the whole world with it. And then they killed him.
And we've lost it. We've lost it.
And they killed him because I'm personally convinced, after having studied this in depth for decades now, and now we have the report completely debunking the Warren Commission with the magic bullet being no magic bullet at all, but a bullet that the Secret Service pulled out of the back of Kennedy's seat and put on the stretcher, debunking the entire forensic basis of the Warren Commission. I'm pretty convinced that it was rogue elements within the U.S. government itself.
Well, Alan Dulles.
Alan Dulles,
Can't
CIA.
get more evil. Can't get more evil than that.
Exactly. We don't know exactly who, but this was a conspiracy, and it was a conspiracy against peace. And it's our security state is in full force. Our president, in my view, is not in control. And in any event, has been a hardliner and a Cold Warrior, whatever you want to call it, well past the Cold War. These neocons don't understand peace. They don't understand negotiation. They don't understand diplomacy. They don't understand the nuclear threat. And one other point, Chris, of the speech that I think is so pertinent and completely neglected, Kennedy says, above all, while defending our own vital interests, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world. And the U.S. has gone out to humiliate Putin and to defeat Putin. And Russia has 6,000 nuclear weapons. What are we doing? What are we thinking? Of course, I take it a little bit, even a step back. I think this is, I call it the war of NATO enlargement, because I think the entire war in Ukraine came because the United States so recklessly and imprudently kept pushing NATO enlargement. Russia saying, stop. It's a red line. Stop. And then not to Ukraine, for heaven's sake, not to Ukraine, our 2,300 kilometer border, not to surround us in the Black Sea. And the U.S. is deaf to this. And then trying to humiliate Putin and doing exactly the opposite of what Kennedy said. And I take it seriously when Kennedy says in that remark about not pushing a nuclear power to a corner, he says, above all, as if that's the synthesis of what he's learned from the Cuban Missile Crisis. Above all, don't humiliate a nuclear adversary. And our people don't even know it. We don't have diplomats, and we don't have a president, in my view, that understands the job of keeping the foot on the brake. So it's a very dangerous time.
I think the explanation is straightforward. The neocons are not interested in strategic balance or strategic stability. They're interested in global hegemony. They adopt and pursue the idea that the United States is, should be, and can remain the world's sole superpower. This is absurd in substance, because the United States is not, cannot, and should not be the world's sole superpower. The United States is 4.2% of the world population. It should do its share. It should be responsible. It should promote strategic balance, not hegemony, or what some in the U.S. security state call full spectrum dominance. The neocons are not interested in balance. They are therefore actually undermining balance wherever it is. The whole reason for the war in Ukraine is the United States could not accept a mutually respectful peace with Russia. The United States had to keep moving NATO eastward to surround Russia. The United States does not accept a mutually respectful relationship with China. The United States wants to surround China with its military bases and military alliances. This is why the situation is so destabilizing, because the United States is not, and by the United States, by the way, I don't mean the US people, I mean the security state, which is dominated by this arrogance of unipolarity. They're not seeking stability, they're seeking dominance. And seeking dominance is not only, I think, immoral, but utterly impracticable, because the United States is not dominant. It is one of many powerful countries in the world, but there are many major powers in the world, and the United States seems intent to take them on. It won't succeed, but it will leave bloodshed, massive bloodshed, in the places that are trapped between the superpower fights, and Ukraine is the latest victim It was a victim that was talked into its role by promises by the United States that we'll defeat Russia together. Of course, in the end, Russia is not defeated, but Ukraine is reduced to rubble. And this is unfortunately the American tendency.
Now, where do you think leaves us this insight, like for neutrality and non-alignment, especially for countries that are really kind of trying to be non-aligned, not this kind of lapdog neutrality that Austria and Switzerland and Ireland are going, because they have already been captured pretty much by the ideology, by the same ideology. But those states in Africa, South America, and India and Southeast Asia that don't want to go along, I mean, this puts a target on them as well, right? The United States will see any kind of third-party policy as inherently antagonistic. I mean, these neocons, the Victoria Nuland types.
Well, I think that from a strategic point of view, each region needs to get together so it's not picking off one country at a time, but actually regions cooperating. So I strongly advocate that ASEAN work together as a group. I advocate that the South American countries, indeed, it would be good if the Latin American and Caribbean countries, but at least the regions, work together as a group. The United States approach is divide and conquer, the old strategy that dates back 2,000 years to the Roman Empire. So it picks off Venezuela, and then it divides Latin America between those who are on the U.S. side against Venezuela and those who are on the Venezuelan side. But what, of course, is the right response for Latin America is don't be divided that way. If you are divided that way, everybody loses. Millions of refugees from Venezuela that came from a brutal and premeditated attempt by the United States to overthrow the Maduro government. And who pays the consequences? All of the region, of course, Venezuela first in a shocking collapse of the economy and social life, but Colombia and other neighboring countries that have become home to millions of refugees from Venezuela. So I'm extremely happy, although it's very difficult, that Lula is back in the presidency in Brazil, because Lula can bring together the Latin American governments to say to the United States also, look, we're not your enemy, but stop dividing us, stop trying to overthrow governments in our region, because we don't want that. And that really needs to be the response everywhere. The United States traps countries in proxy wars, and those countries lose. I tried to tell my Ukrainian counterparts, they were at that time my Ukrainian friends, then they stopped listening to me and wanting to repudiate what I was saying, but I kept warning them, you are going to get trapped by the United States. And this is exactly what has happened.
Do you have any more hope for Taiwan? Because it seems to me the US is trying to do exactly the same now with preparing Taiwan to be an unsinkable aircraft carrier and then have bloodshed without end on Taiwan in order to fight a proxy war with China.
I was just in Taiwan. I was given a wonderful award called the Tang Prize by a fantastic foundation. I spoke to a major Buddhist foundation in Taiwan, the Tzu Chi Foundation. And what a wonderful society, what a successful place. And I gave the warning everywhere that I could, don't get trapped into this U.S. PRC fight, because this would be devastating. The United States basically is led by a lot of ignoramuses. I happen to know a lot of them. They're very poorly educated. They're educated in a kind of American arrogance. They are outdated by 30 years, thinking that the world is just at the U.S. doorstep. or that the U.S. has the prerogatives, I should say better, anywhere in the world. They don't know what they're doing. And I try to say to Taiwanese leaders, be careful, because this is really what happened in Ukraine. Now, the U.S. approach is so mind-bogglingly wrong-headed. It says the way to protect a country is to arm it. Well, this is the fallacy that my late and great colleague at Columbia University, Robert Jervis, wrote about for decades, what he called the security dilemma. The United States may look at arming a country as a, quote, defensive action, but from the point of view of the country on the other side of that arming, that looks like a pretty aggressive action, and it therefore triggers a response. It triggers a retaliation. It makes conflict more likely. So the United States poured arms into Ukraine after 2014. It thought it was going to make peace that way. Well, yeah, maybe some of these dunderheads in Washington believed that, but of course it was leading towards conflict. And the idea that the way to protect Taiwan is by making Taiwan what they call in Washington a porcupine, so armed that it won't be touched, with all those quills protecting it. This is absurd. The arms shipments would only make Taiwan more and more endangered, more and more at risk. The way to reduce, even eliminate these risks is diplomacy. Diplomacy between the United States and China, diplomacy between Taiwanese leaders and mainland Chinese leaders. Talk with each other. For heaven's sake, there is an absolute vital interest on both sides of the Taiwan Straits for peace. There really is. And if the United States would just get out of the way for a moment, and the two sides could talk with each other, they'd actually find a way forward. But the United States comes in with its naive and destabilizing promises. We'll keep you safe. Yeah, they'll keep Taiwan safe like they kept Afghanistan safe, like they kept South Korea safe, like they kept Ukraine safe. In other words, not at all. And how many failures do these neocons, how many failures are they going to have before they are finally taken off the pedestal of power? By the way, it's not that the American people believe any of this. It's just that we don't have a functioning representative government. Our foreign policy has been taken in the hands of Raytheon and General Dynamics and these neocons. The American people are asked nothing about this. So this is not a reflection of the martial spirit of the American people, although our mainstream media feed a lot of absolute falsehoods to the American people. But it is the fact that foreign policy is in the hands of the security state, that is governed economically by the military-industrial complex, which funds the major committees in Congress, which provide the votes and the money for a $1 trillion plus annual military outlay. And that's where we are right now. It's absolutely awful. In the United States, foreign policy is the small preserve of the military-industrial complex.
I share that analysis with you. The oxymoron to me is that the United States keeps talking about itself. So, and I apologize again, the same people that you're talking about keep talking about the United States as a force for good and a force for peace, when in reality, the United States is highly militarized, highly militaristic, and reacts to conflict always with military components. That surprises me.
Well, I would add, I think since the end of the Second World War, the United States has been the most militarized and most violent country in the world. And this is just a matter of record. One recent scholarly account, a very good one, counted 70 U.S.-led regime change operations between 1947 and 1989. So the study was over the Cold War period. And just in that period, 1947 to 1989, 70 regime change operations, 6 of which were overt wars to overthrow a foreign government, and 64 were covert operations. Now, this is stunning. First of all, covert operations don't remain covert. It's pretty obvious if you're a reader of the New York Times, which wants you to suck your thumb and go to sleep. But if you're a thinker who's looking at the actual evidence, pretty clear when the U.S. is covertly overthrowing another government like it tried to do in Syria. Now, the point is that this is the normal U.S. modus operandi: war, coups, and overthrows. And after 1989, the big change wasn't that the United States stopped that behavior. The big change was the United States thought it could get away with anything, whether in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Syria. In 2011, Obama and Hillary, well, they decided, okay, we're going to overthrow Assad. That was just a conscious decision. And 12 years later, they left that country in shambles because they're fools. That what do they think? That they can dictate? By the way, they said, both Obama and Trump, okay, we're going to overthrow Maduro. We'll do it through economic sanctions. They crushed the economy. And as stupid as they are in Washington, they said, okay, we'll now pretend that Maduro's not the president. We'll just name another president from outside, Juan Guaido. And you have to think, is this a cartoon? Is this a fairy tale? Are these idiots that they think that from Washington they can name the president of Venezuela? But they actually tried to do this for several years. And I have friends well, they wouldn't call me friends, but in academia in the East Coast in the US that said, okay, I'm going to work for the new Guaido government. I said, Guaido government, because the US names him as president, he's suddenly president, you're going to work for him? Come on. So this is a deep and continuing tendency. The United States, it seems to me, forgot any kind of diplomacy. Diplomacy means you sit down and you negotiate mutual concerns. And by the way, to be successful, you show respect to the other side. And you try to listen to the concerns of the other side so that you can find a durable solution. That whole approach has completely gone. They don't even know how to negotiate. They have no interest in negotiating. They don't talk about it. This is amazing to me.
And there is actually a new study that shows that the rate of foreign intervention of the United States picked up after 1989 and didn't slow down. So the idea that the end of the Cold War would reduce interventions is actually wrong. This can be shown now. And one last question to you. Reconciliation with Russia. You wrote recently a wonderful piece on your homepage about how Kennedy would have made peace, and I mean John F. Kennedy. And in that piece, though, supposes two things. One, Kennedy supposed that the US and USSR were equals, and two, he supposed that both states wanted to make peace. Now, it strikes me that both of these assumptions are not true anymore. Or do you think the US thinks of Russia as an equal and as somebody that they want peace with, unless it is with Russia in broken up?
Well, the neocons had a plan to try to either overthrow Putin or to so-called decolonize Russia. I mean, it's a vulgar thing. They didn't want to deal with Russia as a counterpart country for negotiations. On December 17, 2021, President Putin put on the table a draft U.S.-Russia security agreement. This was the last off-ramp to avoid the Ukraine escalation in 2022. I urge the White House, talk now. based on that document. There's a lot in there that's absolutely valid. Most importantly, stop the NATO enlargement to Ukraine, which has no sense and which is a Russian red line for completely understandable reasons. No, we don't talk to any third party about NATO, is the US refrain. That means we don't negotiate, we don't understand diplomacy, we don't recognize Russia's legitimate security concerns. And you end up with wars this way. Now, I continue to believe to this moment that if Biden said the words, we will recognize Russia's legitimate security concerns in a legitimate peace agreement that also respects Ukraine's sovereignty, that respects America's security interests and Russia's security interests, we could actually get to a negotiated peace. And pretty quickly, it would be based on Ukraine as a neutral country. A fact that Zelensky himself noted in a brief moment in 2022 until the United States told him to stop noting that and demanded that Ukraine shut down the negotiations. So Zelensky actually came back to what had been the basis of Ukraine's independence, the basis of its constitution, and the basis of an effective foreign policy for Ukraine neutrality. He came back to that. The United States tried to shut it down. Well, of course, the US policy is failing badly, not for the first time, for continuously failing, because this is American foreign policy, but it's destroying Ukraine in the process. Can the two sides, US and Russia, actually still end this through negotiations, this war? Of course they could. Even today, I keep saying, to Biden, if you want to talk, I'll give you my Zoom link. You can make a Zoom link with Putin. Go ahead. You want to borrow my cell phone? Call him. Start negotiations. They're basically cowards in the US in the sense that they won't negotiate, because Kennedy put it right. He said, let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate. And they're afraid of negotiating in Washington, or they just forgot what it even means. So they don't have diplomats. I don't know what it is, but I've never seen anything like this. The absence of trying to find the way out of this disaster. And they need to open negotiations now.